Good morning, good afternoon, good day to everybody. A really warm welcome to From Small Beginnings, A Century of Eugenics on Our Borders online symposium. This event has been organised in collaboration with CRASH, the Canada Region Anti-Eugenics Scholarship Hub, and a really big thank you to Leslie Diglon and others at CRASH for making this event possible. We're also this event is also in collaboration with the Eugenics Legacy Education Project at UCL. And I'm Helen Nola, and I lead that project at UCL. I'm delighted to be able to introduce you to Maria Elena Ngape's keynote, Connecting the Dots to Build a More Just and Equitable Future for All. Please do add your questions in the Q&A function, and we'll be having a discussion at the end of Maria Elena's presentation. Any questions that we can't cover in the time that we've got available, we will come back to and circulate some responses after the event. I'm delighted to introduce you to Maria Elena Ngape, who is a distinguished immigration fellow and visiting scholar at Cornell's Immigration Law and Policy Programme. Most recently, Maria Elena was the executive director of the Los Angeles-based National Immigration Law Center, that's the NILC, and the NILC Immigrant Justice Fund until November 22, where she served for over 22 years. Maria Elena is the youngest of 10 children from Medellin, Colombia, who emigrated to Central Falls, Rhode Island, when her father was recruited to work in the textile mills. She's writing a forthcoming book, Becoming America, a personal history of a nation's immigration wars, under contract with Flatiron Books, to be published in 2026, with the goal of shaping the conversation around the United States' 250th anniversary. A really, really warm welcome, and I'm going to hand over to Maria Elena. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Helen, and for your work and all the organizers of this timely and critically important global symposium, including the teams at Small Beginnings, at the Canada Region Anti-Eugenics Scholarship Hub, CRASH, and the Eugenic Legacies Education Project, ELEP. I want to give a special thanks to Benedict Ipgrave, with whom I've been in conversations now about this symposium for, can't believe it's over 6 months. And thanks to all of you who are joining us over these next 2 days from all over the world as we gather to commemorate the centennial of these landmark laws that shaped not only the United States, but served as a perverse inspiration for the most heinous atrocities against humanity, against Jews, as Yale professor James Whitman notes in his book, Hitler's American Model, the United States and the Making of Nazi Race Law. Saludos and greetings from the land of the Confederation of Indigenous Massachusetts People, where I am joining you today virtually. My family recently celebrated our 50th anniversary of migrating to the United States. After first clearing immigration customs at the Miami International Airport, we arrived in Boston Logan Airport, just very close by to where I am today, to be reunited with my father, who had been working at the Cadillac textile mill in Rhode Island. I was 3 years old at the time. Some years have gone by, 50 in fact. We came from Medellin, Colombia in the 1970s, when the civil rights movement created the cultural openings and political ability for Congress to finally repeal the racial and national origin quotas of the Johnson-Reed Act through the 1965 Immigration Act. Like millions of immigrants throughout history and across the world, my parents came to the United States to give my 9 siblings and me a better life. As my family grew, it came to contain almost the entirety of the modern US immigration experience. One of my brothers, for example, married the daughter of a Polish and Russian immigrants who settled in Pennsylvania. My sister-in-law, her name is Renee, her grandfather was a coal miner and he was illiterate when he arrived from Russia in 1893, 1 year after Ellis Island opened. Her grandmother migrated from Poland in 1913. And today I am joining you from my niece's home, whose husband, Paul, his great-grandparents immigrated from Ireland in 1880 and Italy in 1916. Each of those ancestors came at a time of growing anti-immigrant sentiments against the Irish, Russians, Poles, Italians, and others, which led to the enactment of the Johnson-Reed Act. Had those relatives tried to migrate just a few years later, they would have been banned from the United States. My siblings would not have met the loves of their lives, and my nieces and nephews would not have been born. I'm also aware that if my parents, Arturo and Teresa, were trying to migrate today from Colombia, we would not be considered worthy of being here. My family came during a rare opening in US politics when immigrants were welcome and able to stay, when my family was able to be reunited rather than ripped apart. Through many sacrifices and public policies that gave my siblings and me the opportunity to access financial aid and get a higher education, my siblings and I have become educators, biochemists, physical therapists, small business owners, and contributors in so many ways, socially, culturally, economically, to this nation, which is our adopted home. We are not takers, invaders, rapists, or animals, as some politicians claim of migrants. Our collective work over the next 2 days could not be more timely, given the state of today's world. Yesterday marked the centennial of the Immigration Act of 1924, or the Johnson-Reed Act, which President Calvin Coolidge signed into law on May 26th, followed by the Labor Appropriations Act on May 28, which created the Border Patrol for the first time. As we pause to commemorate these 1924 laws, let's remember that these laws were just a snapshot of society at that moment in time. The work of academics, pseudoscientists, and others who were shaping the culture through their ideas, words, their writings in newspapers, radio interviews, speaking at union or political rallies, all of that created the conditions for those laws to pass. The role of academia was essential then, as it is now, in shaping the narratives of our times. Take, for example, the founding members of the Immigration Restriction League, which included Robert Ward, who had been on the Harvard Admissions Committee and was responsible for also establishing racial quotas for college admissions. Another thing that assisted in bringing about this ideology, from economic restrictionist immigration to biological restrictionist, were literary works. Among the most well-known was The Passing of the Great Race by Madison Grant, who wrote in 1916, quote, "The result of unlimited immigration is showing plainly in the rapid decline in the birth rate of the native stock," end quote. This view was espoused by Harry Laughlin, who was the editor of the Eugenical News and was appointed the, quote, "expert eugenic agent" for the House Committee on Immigration and Naturalization. In his testimony before Congress in 1922, Laughlin stated, quote, "The recent immigrants present a higher percentage of inborn, socially inadequate qualities than do the older stocks," end quote. Even though geneticists of this time generally disavowed the, quote, "science" that was behind eugenics, no scientist spoke out against Laughlin's science. This testimony led to a rise in the number of publications espousing these ideas. The Lothrop Stoddard published The Rising Tide of Color and the Racial Realities of Europe. Kenneth Roberts and Gino Speranza wrote articles about eugenics, and Robert Ward lectured on these issues. Eugenics has been implicit in many immigration laws since the 19th century, laying the foundation for the Page Act of 1875, targeting women of Chinese descent, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the Public Charge Rule, which targeted people with disabilities and poor people, and was added to the Immigration Act of 1882, was expanded in 1891, and most recently in 2017. Although the Border Patrol wasn't created until May 28, 1924, federal inspectors were routinely trying to prevent Chinese migrants from coming before then. And then a week later, President Coolidge signed into law the Indian Citizenship Act on June 2nd, authorizing the Secretary of Interior to issue citizenship certificates to Native Americans. Before this, they were the only people born on this land who had not gained birthright citizenship with the 14th Amendment in 1868. Although they were the original stewards of this land, Native Americans were the last ones to receive birthright citizenship. I will return to this issue of birthright citizenship towards the end of my talk. Together, these three laws defined who was considered worthy of becoming American a century ago, and they continue to reverberate today. This is a stark reminder that nothing is guaranteed. Nothing can be taken for granted. Nothing is permanent. We must remain vigilant. We must connect the dots and take stock of where we have been as a humanity, where we are now, and what our future's choices are. The underlying eugenics and racist underpinnings of the 1924 laws are dangerously similar to today's anti-immigrant rhetoric. Take the words, for example, from Charles B. Davenport from his report, The Eugenics of Immigration, in the Popular Science Monthly, which was published in January of 1916. In there, he proclaimed, quote, "The population of the United States will, on account of the recent immigration, rapidly become darker in pigmentation, smaller in stature, more mercurial, more given to crimes of larceny, kidnapping, assault, murder, rape, and sex immorality." Or take the words during the House hearings, the hearings before the House Committee on Immigration and Naturalization. That hearing in particular was called The Analysis of America's Modern Melting Pot in 1922, where Harry Laughlin said, quote, "The American population, when analyzed, shows that the newer immigration, while it furnishes a high percentage of our criminals, our paupers, and our insane, are nevertheless furnishes a far smaller proportion of our intellectual leaders," end quote. To further back up a similar point, Representative Robert Allen from West Virginia stated, quote, "The primary reason for the restriction of the alien stream, however, is the necessity for purifying and keeping pure the blood of America." There was some opposition to the bill, but the complaints at the time were very lightly dismissed. The bill was sent to the House floor for a vote, and there were only 2 dissenting votes in that committee, and they were by Adolph Sabath and Samuel Dickstein, who were both Jewish. Dickstein stated at the time, quote, "If you had been a member of that committee, you could not help but understand that they did not want anybody else in this country except Nordics," end quote. Their words are achingly similar to the statements by today's politicians across the world who are weaponizing migration to stoke racial fear of Black and brown migrants and refugees to divide working class people. They are exploiting people's economic pain and the fear for their children's future. Today, like 100 years ago, they are tapping into people's anxieties about the changing demographics of their neighborhoods. Just like 100 years ago, presidential candidates in the United States are making similar statements. Take Governor DeSantis, for example, who during a press conference in Tallahassee, Florida on January 25th in 2024, just a few months ago, said, quote, "Mass migration is changing the face of our nation and threatening our cultural integrity. We must take action to preserve our national identity," end quote. Or take presidential candidate Trump's dangerous comments from September of 2023 that are so reminiscent of the last 100 years, who said, quote, "They are poisoning our country. They are poisoning the blood of our country. They're coming from all over the world. They're coming from prisons. They're coming from mental institutions and insane asylums. They're terrorists." Absolutely, that's poisoning our country. That's poisoning the blood of our country. We hear these statements, they're repeated over and over again, sometimes in print, sometimes in rallies, sometimes on the radio, in interviews, and they are desensitizing us. They are becoming normalized, and we need to understand these anti-migrant, anti-refugee attacks for what they are. They are an affront to democracy. This is part of the dangerous Great Replacement theory that claims that there is a conspiracy among Jews, Democrats in the United States, and others to replace white people with Black and brown people, including migrants. Words matter greatly. This dangerous rhetoric has already led to massacres over the last few years against African Americans at a Black-run grocery store in Buffalo, against Latinos at a Walmart in El Paso, against the Jewish community at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, and against Asian women at a spa in Atlanta, Georgia. This anti-democratic authoritarian playbook was most evident to me at the beginning of the Trump administration, when in 2017, they leaked a draft of a public charge rule that would have radically expanded that rule from 1882. It was perhaps the most pernicious and consequential attack on immigrants and it was the one that reminded me most about my own family. Since 1882, the federal government in the United States could prevent anyone that was unable or considered unable to take care of him or herself without becoming a public charge from entering the United States. And for decades, and actually for over a century, that arcane rule had been used in very limited ways. But Trump and his advisor, Stephen Miller, wanted to radically expand it by blocking immigrants from getting a green card if they had ever received basic supports like healthcare, nutrition, or housing assistance, even if they were legally eligible for those programs. If Trump had succeeded, 26 million migrants would have been shut off from those supports, including 9 million US citizen children. Trump's rhetoric was about keeping migrants off of welfare, but it was a red herring. The underlying goal was to limit green cards and permanent futures in the United States for wealthy migrants. Those restricted would be mostly from Latin America, Africa, and Asia. That in turn would change the complexion of migration and make America whiter. In describing who should be excluded, the preamble to Trump's public charge, in essence, described my family. My father was born into poverty. He left school at age 8 to work his first job as a shoeshine boy. And in his 40s, he was spotted by a US talent scout as a skilled textile worker. My father and other Colombian men were recruited to come to Rhode Island. His employment visa turned into a green card, and today he would be deemed unskilled, unwanted. If he wanted to flee a civil war, which that's partially what we were doing when we left Colombia at the beginning of the Civil War, and if he wanted to stay for a better life, he would only have 2 options: to either arrive on a temporary work visa that had no possibility for a permanent future and would not allow him to be reunited and to petition for our family the way he did, or he would have the choice of overstaying that visa or crossing the border without legal papers. After my father arrived, he was able to send for us. My mother and the kids, we joined him, and we were all able to come on green cards. The United States at that time in the 1970s considered keeping a family like mine together to be a central tenet of its immigration policy. Today, my low-income family would be considered a possible public charge, a burden, a taker. If my father were to send for us today, he would soon find that there isn't even a legal option for a family like mine to join him. Only the temporary guest workers' cheap labor is wanted. With their green cards in hand, my parents could work. Today in the United States, there are an estimated almost 11 million undocumented immigrants who are working unlawfully because Congress has refused to create a legislative path or green cards. The majority of those 10 million immigrants have been here for over a decade. They are in essence permanent residents without that legal recognition. When my parents were laid off from work or ultimately lost their jobs, what saved our family was the ability to access unemployment benefits or sometimes food stamps that helped to make ends meet. Today, my parents would have become undocumented. They would be ineligible. By the test of the 1973 policies, when we arrived, my family was deemed worthy of becoming American. Today, that same family would not be worth letting in. And if they were here unauthorized, they would be a priority for deportation, for the mass roundups and internment camps that are now being planned. As we gather today, we are at risk of birthright citizenship being denied again to the children who were born in the United States if they have undocumented immigrant parents. On the first day of a second term, the campaign for candidate Trump is pledging to sign an executive order that would withhold the passports, the social security numbers, and other government benefits from children of undocumented migrants born in the United States. The stakes are high for all of us across the world. Everyone committed to creating an open and equitable democracy where a multiracial society can flourish and thrive must take stock of how migration policy evolves around the world. The centennial of the immigration laws is not just a moment for reflection, it's a call to action. We are at a historical fork in the road. Those of us in the United States who are citizen by birthright or naturalization have a responsibility to choose whether we will allow politicians to take us back over a century ago to the eugenics-inspired laws, or whether we will take a balanced approach of finally overhauling our migration system that restores equity, freedom, safety, and humanity for the next century. We have the power to shape a more inclusive and equitable future, but only if we learn from the past and refuse to let history repeat itself. This is why today, your work, your research, your writings are essential to our future at a time when history is under attack. Just these days, this week, I just listened to a podcast that was published by Mark Krikorian, the executive director of the Citizenship for Immigration Systems, and Roy Beck, the founder of Numbers USA, two staunch anti-immigrant restrictionist entities with white supremacist roots and underpinnings. And they are rewriting history as we are meeting today and tomorrow. Their podcast is about how the 1924 law was the most effective and positive law for working class people in the United States. And that is what is at stake right now when history is being rewritten, when there is a revisionist approach, when books are being banned in our school, when freedom of expression and association on college campuses is being policed. Our work, everyone here in this symposium, our work is to be truth tellers on history, to be the seers of a better tomorrow in which everyone's humanity and dignity are recognized, valued, and respected. Finally, I want to acknowledge that these are hard times, when sometimes it may feel easier to stay on the sidelines or to stay at home reading a good book under the covers. And that's important also. But let's remember that eugenics and white supremacy thrives on isolation, on labels, on division, and that the antidote is community, it's action, it's working together, it's remembering that we are interdependent, we are connected, that the work that we are doing together over these next 2 days as part of the symposium that is across national borders is essential to a future in which we all belong, that it is essential to a future in which we together can build a better world, a world in which we all belong, in which we recognize our humanity, and that we together get to shape the future of our society for the next 100+ years. I'm so grateful for the work that every single one of you is doing. As a first-time author working on my book, I am relying greatly on so much of the research that each of you have been doing and that I'm hoping to learn more about over these next 2 days with you. Lastly, I will say that your work is so important. It is so critical. It cannot stay only within academia. It cannot stay only among speaking to like-minded people and people who already believe in us and who believe in our worldview. We must take the beautiful and important research that you are each doing, your writings, your book, your academic papers. They have to be translated into accessible language in many, many languages for just common people who want to understand, how does this affect me? We need to be on radio programs, on podcasts. We need to be writing op-eds. We need to be doing interviews, speaking to people on the street, in cafes, at our family dinners, at the gardens, at the local parks, anywhere and everywhere that we are all walking through our daily lives. We have a responsibility to be making sure that the important work of this community of researchers, of academics, of authors at this symposium, that we are spreading that word so that it reaches the children, that it reaches tomorrow's policymakers, tomorrow's leaders as well, so that again, together we build a future in which we all belong. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Marilena, for an inspiring opening to this gathering. Particularly inspiring to hear your strategies and ideas for the ways that we disrupt these long and harmful legacies. I'd just like to remind everybody, if you have a question or a comment or something that you'd like to share and hear Marielena's reflections on, please write it in the Q&A and we will take a look. I was very interested in a phrase that you used where you talked about a rare opening when your family came to the US. And I wonder if you can kind of reflect on the conditions around that period of time and how that rare opening emerged and stayed open, but also maybe talk a little bit about how that then was closed down.
Yes, thank you for that, Helen. You know, as someone who grew up in the United States and in the air in the United States, and there's this myth of the United States as a so-called nation of immigrants, although I have dedicated my legal career in the last 3 decades to fighting for migrant justice, I realized when I started my research for my book that in fact, this country has been primarily a country of many, many restrictions, including from the very beginning of the founding, the racialized and violent founding of this nation. And so when you look at the 1924 laws that we are commemorating with the symposium, all the way through the 1965 law, that finally, and also the 1952 that started opening that, I do believe that the conditions that allowed for that really do come from the Black community, from the civil rights movement, the resilience and resistance of Black, of Indigenous, of women leaders, of people who throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s were fighting for a better world for everyone. And that the 1965 Immigration Act was in part, we benefited as migrants from those openings. And in the 1970s, we saw that increase in migration. And although the racial and national origin quotas did not apply to the Western Hemisphere, the fact is that migration was restricted throughout, or was not restricted, but in practice, people were being brought over in lots of different ways. But there was also a lot of activism throughout those decades between 1924 and 1965 that led to small openings in different ways. And I often think right now when things seem so hard, that although our vision is for a much greater vision, a much more open society, that we also need to take every victory that we get, big or small, and see them as building blocks, because it is those wins that will inspire other people to fight for greater wins as well. And so, you know, I think of that period of the 1970s started closing in 1986 with Ronald Reagan, and those closures were not just closures about migrants. They were attacks on working people. They were attacks on unions, attacks on women. And we continue to see that in 1996 under the Clinton administration with both the welfare reform law and immigration reform laws in the United States that further restricted, and particularly then also restricted and began that criminalization of migrants, where being in the United States was now being penalized and policed in ways that it hadn't been before. And we've continued to see the door further closing to the moment that we're at right now, which is extremely dangerous for the globe as a whole.
Thank you. Just to pick up on another thread that you were starting to pull at, which I think is quite interesting, and hopefully folks in the symposium will reflect further on. You talked about taking stock of immigration policy, and this made me reflect on policy literacy, and certainly from a perspective here in England. And particularly around the histories and legacies of eugenics and its influence in policy making. That's not something that many people are conversant with. Mm-hmm. So I wonder what you think around this kind of notion of this policy literacy that we need to have in order to understand these harmful practices playing out in our everyday lives.
Absolutely, Helen. I think that policy literacy is extremely important, and it's one of the reasons that I mentioned towards the end of my keynote that I really encourage everyone in this symposium, and I'm hoping that one of the outcomes of the symposium is finding ways to popularize the important work that all of the researchers in the symposium are doing, because if we're not reaching, and I'm thinking these days in particular, and we're not reaching children or young people and helping them to understand and to connect the dots with where we have been historically and how it is all connected, right? And in fact, I often think of in the United States, for example, how the blueprint that the first Trump administration and now the candidate Trump is providing us, and they're saying very clearly, here's what we are planning to do. And they're directly connected to eugenics. They are directly connected to colonization. They're directly connected to the erasure of indigenous peoples around the world. And unless we are helping people understand how these things are connected, unless people understand how today's migration policies have those roots, but also how today's migration policies impact each of us. And, you know, I find it terrifying that on the one hand, you have anti-migrant, anti-refugee groups across the world, authoritarians who know, they understand that if you attack migrants, it is a way to undermine democracy, but that the majority of the public does not see how these are connected. And I think that is the piece that I think is really critical, that we help people understand how migration policy is evolving. And although you may not be a migrant, or you may be many generations removed, that the fact is that migration policy is being used to actually impact your life and new generations' future lives as well.
Thank you. I have lots of questions, but I want to just give people a little bit of time maybe to pop something into the Q&A. I can see one has just popped forward. So this person has said, an amazing talk, really very inspiring, and a call for action. Thank you. How important a journey has it been for you to look through these histories through the lens of your own family story as well? That's a fascinating
Thank you.
question.
Yeah, thank you for that question. You know, I, as I said, I've been, you know, I decided to go to law school very specifically wanting to focus on immigrant workers because that was my personal experience with my parents and my family. And that's what I've dedicated my life to, fighting for other new migrants, because our family experience, as I explained, when we came with a green card, and that little piece of paper that is not even green, but it's called a green card, opened so many doors for our family and our ability. But it was the combination of migration policies plus other progressive policies like job training programs, school lunches, like so many economic justice policies that allowed for our family to thrive and to be where we are today. And so throughout my career, I have focused on trying to dismantle the barriers that keep other people from belonging, that keep other people from being able to achieve what my family had been able to achieve. And it's the reason I've focused primarily on low-income migrant families, like our experience. And so it's interesting, the question that you ask is interesting because when I thought about taking a step back, when I stepped down from the National Immigration Law Center and writing a book, I really thought that the story I was going to tell was about our migration from Colombia and our experience over the last decades. But what I realized is needed was not actually only to tell our story of my immediate family, but actually the collective of my extended family, because I want to help people connect back to their immigrant roots or their loved ones' immigrant roots. I have family members, for example, whose parents, our ancestors came from Holland or from England, others who, as I mentioned, Italy or Ireland, et cetera. And again, people feel so disconnected from their migrant histories that my goal through my book is to help people make that connection again. And in part, it comes from a hypothesis that I started thinking a lot about during the Trump years, which is that if you could take politics out of it and you could just sit people together and have people talk, and I believe this is true in any country. I think it's true in Europe, in the US, in Canada, elsewhere, that if people could just talk to each other as human beings, they would recognize that they have the same fears for their life today, for their children's futures. They have the same concerns, the same dreams, the same hopes of a better life for their family and for their loved ones. And that when people have been ripped off or denied that connection to their roots, to their identity, then there's a part of them that is broken. There is a part of them that then allows them, they've lost some part of their humanity, and that allows them to dehumanize other migrants today. And so the place where I've landed is to tell a more fuller story of the country's immigration history through my own extended family's immigration history. And I do believe that telling these stories, not only through law and policy, which is what I feel most comfortable telling, but instead through stories, hopefully will reach a broader audience as well.
Thank you so much. We've got time for one more question, I think. And this person says, many historians are having a heated debate over scholarship that connects to issues on present, calling this research anachronistic, less scientific than a positivist, objective history. Considering the importance of the relations you've highlighted in your inspiring talk, how do you respond to this kind of criticism that looks to undermine the credibility of our research, calling it emotional?
Really important question, because I think part of what is happening is those critiques and those critics know that they are on the losing side of history and that they are on the losing side of justice. And so the way to try to criticize is by calling us emotional. I think it reminds me immediately of the very gendered attacks on women and throughout history of whenever you raise concerns, like really attacking it from that emotional place. And one of the first things I would say is, we collectively have a responsibility to make sure that our academic research is rigorous and disciplined, and that we are taking the steps to do so and challenging, right? Not getting on the defense and not also simply giving in to those critiques, but really having a diverse of messengers, a diverse way of how we're getting the information out as well. And look, those critics often don't care about the truth and often just put things out without caring about whether anybody will care or not, or will look at the underlying value of that. And so I think it's important both to be rigorous in our research and in our writings and everything, while continue to go on offense and not worry about those critics in that same way, but making sure and being willing to debate them, willing to take them on. Again, as I shared earlier, I was not surprised that this podcast that I just heard about from Mark Krikorian and Numbers USA, Roy Beck, is doing the exact opposite of what we are doing in the symposium. And they're putting it out there through a podcast. It's probably reaching many, many more people. And by doing so and trying to rewrite history, they're not thinking twice about whether their arguments are going to be challenged or not. They're just going forward with it. And I think that we have to be really cautious. It's a balance, right? We are people of great values and integrity, and we need to move forward as well.
Thank you. Final question. I'm aware of the time, but this one is a good one. Great talk. Thank you. Can you say more about the 1965 Act? It seems that a lot of the backlash is a consequence of that, especially as it impacts Mexicans. And they've put in brackets, the law imposed quotas on Mexicans, but they kept immigrating.
Yes, it's a really great question. And I would even say that I think the other thing that is coming up, which is connected to the last question, is one of the arguments that is becoming very, very prominent and resonant in the United States in particular is to claim that, like this recent podcast about the centennial of the 1924 laws, that immigration law actually had a benefit for Blacks in the United States and for working class people. And now with the 1965 Act, we're hearing similar arguments and a backlash against the diversity that has resulted in the United States, and targeting, saying, actually, Latinos, US born Latinos in the United States and Blacks are missing out because of the number of migrants that have arrived, and Mexicans and the migration increased rather than the quotas that were, the restrictions that were added. But what people, and this is where, again, the collective work of all of the participants in the symposium is so critical, is help people connect the dots. The reason that we have the levels of migration and undocumented migration in the United States today is not only because of the 1965 Act, it's actually because of the 1990 laws. When you take the North American Free Trade Act, for example, NAFTA, so between the US, Canada, and Mexico, the free trade actually resulted in greater poverty in Mexico. It resulted in more people in rural communities losing their work and needing to migrate north, and then coming either as temporary workers or as undocumented workers. And then the 1996 laws under Clinton resulting in these bars for 3 and 10 years, or permanent bars, where people could no longer have circular migration, where people could no longer even apply for a permanent residency, even today, if they're married to a US citizen. And so again, it's taking those arguments and connecting the dots and telling the fuller story, including what our world vision is of where we need to go collectively as a society. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you so much, Marilena. Thank you, everybody, for joining this introduction to our symposium. Warmly invite you to take up Marielena's invitation to make connections, to connect the dots over the next 2 days. There's some fantastic, fascinating talks, and I look forward to talking to some of you, seeing your work, and I hope you enjoy the time together. I believe we have a break now, and so we'll see you again in the next space at 16:55 my time. But yeah, thank you.